In the summer of 2019, the Vasseur family lived in a quiet residential area on the outskirts of Freiburg. The two-story house on Tannenstrasse was unremarkable from the outside. A well-maintained front yard, white shutters, a silver station wagon in the driveway. Samuel Vasseur, 48, worked as a technical manager at a medium-sized mechanical engineering company. His second wife, Morgane Lefebvre, 36, worked as a physiotherapist in a private practice. Living with them was Theo André, Samuel's son from his first marriage. The boy had just graduated from the Albert Schweitzer Schule. His final grade was 1.8, solid enough for an engineering degree at the Technical University of Karlsruhe, which was set to begin in October. Theo had turned 17 in April and would only turn 18 in November. His biological mother had died in a car accident 5 years earlier. Samuel had met Morgane 2 years after his first wife's death at a training course in Stuttgart. The wedding was discreet, with only close relatives invited. Theo had stood next to his father during the ceremony, smiling politely. Neighbors described him as a reserved young man who liked to play basketball and wore his headphones when walking through the neighborhood. Morgane, however, stood out due to her presence. She usually wore athletic clothes, greeted everyone warmly, and occasionally organized barbecues in the garden. On June 22, 2019, the official school graduation ceremony took place. Theo returned home around 11 p.m. His father was already in bed. Samuel had to wake up early for a meeting in Munich. Morgane was still sitting in the kitchen, a glass of white wine in front of her, smartphone in hand. She congratulated Theo on his graduation and asked if he wanted something to eat. He declined and went upstairs. Subtle changes and the doctor's visit. In the following weeks, subtle changes began. Theo spent more time in his room. He continued to work his part-time job, a helper at a hardware store, but colleagues noticed he looked pale and took breaks more often. His shift usually lasted from 2 p.m. to 8 p.m., but several times he asked to leave earlier. The branch manager, Mr. Schneider, asked for the reason. Theo answered evasively, saying he just felt a bit exhausted from the stress of school. In early August, his condition noticeably worsened. He lost 5 kilograms of body weight within 3 weeks. At night, he woke up drenched in sweat. His father became worried and urged him to see the family doctor. Theo initially hesitated, but then agreed. The appointment with Dr. Fabien Renaud took place on a Thursday morning. The practice was in the city center, a small old building with creaking wooden floorboards. Dr. Renaud performed a physical examination. He felt swollen lymph nodes in his neck and under his armpits. His temperature was 38.4 degrees Celsius. Theo also mentioned persistent fatigue and night sweats. The doctor ordered a complete blood count, including tests for infectious diseases. "It could be the Epstein-Barr virus," Renaud said, "but we'll look at everything closely." The blood was drawn, the tubes labeled and sent to the lab. Theo left the practice with a sinking feeling. He cycled back to Tannenstrasse. No one was home. Samuel was at work. Morgane at the physiotherapy practice. Theo lay down on his bed and stared at the ceiling. Somewhere in his head, a fear was forming that he couldn't yet put into words. The diagnosis and confession. 3 days later, on Monday afternoon, Dr. Renaud received the lab results. He immediately called the practice and asked Theo to come in that same day. It sounded urgent. Theo took his bicycle again. This time, the medical assistant led him directly into the examination room without any waiting time. Dr. Renaud closed the door behind him. "Theo," he began calmly, "the blood values show something serious. You are HIV positive." The words hung in the air like lead. Theo stared at the doctor, unable to speak. His hands began to tremble. Dr. Renaud explained that a confirmatory test was necessary, but the probability of a false positive result was very low. Then he asked the question Theo had feared. "Have you been sexually active?" Theo shook his head. No, never. He had never been in a relationship, had never even kissed anyone. Dr. Renaud leaned back, his brow furrowed. Then we have to consider other transmission routes. Were there situations where you came into contact with someone else's blood, injections, medical procedures? Theo denied every question. But then, after a long silence, something broke inside him. His voice was barely a whisper. There were moments with my stepmother, when my father wasn't around. Dr. Renaud listened without interruption. Theo described evenings when Morgane would come into his room late. She sometimes brought him tea, sat on the edge of the bed, and talked about trivial things. At first it was harmless, but after the graduation party, something changed. She touched his shoulder longer than necessary. Once, she put her hand on his knee. Theo had felt uncomfortable, but didn't know how to react. Then came the night, 3 days after the graduation party. His father was on a business trip to Berlin. Morgane had been drinking. Theo smelled the wine on her breath as she leaned over him. He could only recount what happened in fragments. He remembered her hands, her voice telling him not to say anything to anyone. "Your father wouldn't understand," she had whispered. Dr. Renaud documented every word. Under German law, he was obliged to report suspected sexual abuse, especially involving minors. Although Theo was close to majority, the offense remained. The doctor contacted the Freiburg criminal police that same evening. The investigations began the next morning. The Investigation and Evidence Chief Inspector Adrian Müller and his colleague, Chief Detective Inspector Justine Heber, took over the case. Both had years of experience in the Sexual Offences Department and were familiar with complex family constellations. On Tuesday morning, they appeared at Tannenstrasse without prior notice. Samuel Vasseur opened the door, confused by the unexpected visit. Morgane stood behind him in the hallway, arms crossed. Müller explained the reason for their visit in sober terms. There was a suspicion of sexual abuse in the family environment, linked to a possible HIV transmission. Samuel's face lost all colour. Morgane, however, let out a short laugh, a nervous, disbelieving laugh. "That's absurd," she said. "Who would claim such a thing?" Justine Heber did not reply directly, but asked permission to enter the house and examine Theo's room. Samuel nodded mechanically. The officers put on gloves and began collecting evidence. They photographed Theo's bed, collected bedding, and confiscated a drinking glass that was on the nightstand. A laptop was also taken. Theo hadn't used it for weeks. While Müller worked upstairs, Hebert conducted a first interview with Morgane in the living room. The stepmother seemed composed, almost bored. She described her relationship with Theo as normal and respectful. Yes, she sometimes kept him company in the evening when he couldn't sleep. No, nothing inappropriate had ever occurred. "He's a complicated boy," Morgane said. "Since his mother's death, he's had difficulties with closeness. Maybe he's misinterpreting things." Hebert noted every word without changing her expression. She asked if Morgane would be willing to voluntarily undergo an HIV test. Morgane hesitated for only a moment, then agreed. "I have nothing to hide," she said. In the afternoon, both Morgane and Samuel were asked to have their blood drawn. The samples went to the Institute of Virology at the Freiburg University Hospital. There, not only the presence of HIV antibodies would be tested, but also a genotypic resistance analysis would be performed. This analysis compares the genetic sequence of the viruses. If two samples are nearly identical, it suggests direct transmission. In parallel, the forensic team examined the confiscated items. The bedding showed traces of female saliva and vaginal secretions, which DNA analysis clearly assigned to Morgane Lefebvre. Her fingerprints and lipstick residue were also found on the drinking glass. Investigators also found deleted chat histories on Theo's laptop. A forensic IT expert was able to recover some of them. The messages came from an anonymous account, but metadata showed they had been sent over the Vasseur family's Wi-Fi, from a device later identified as Morgane's smartphone. The content was explicit. They contained sexual innuendos and instructions to Theo to keep certain things secret. In one message, she wrote, "If you tell your father anything, he won't believe me. He'll think you're confused." On Thursday, the test results were available. Morgane Lefebvre was HIV positive. Her viral load was high, indicating she had been infected for years but had never been treated. Samuel Vasseur, however, was negative. This meant Morgane had either been infected before the marriage or had contracted it afterward. In any case, she had not informed her husband. The genotypic analysis was even more conclusive. The virus strains of Theo and Morgane showed a 98.7% match. Such values are statistically only possible with direct transmission. Professor Dr. Lang, who performed the analysis, wrote in his expert opinion, "The probability that the infection of patient A, Theo André, was caused by patient B, Morgane Lefebvre, is over 99%. Adrian Müller confronted Morgane with these results. The conversation took place at the police station in a bare interrogation room with tape recording. Morgane's lawyer, Attorney Berger, sat next to her. Müller placed the lab reports on the table. "You are HIV positive," he said. "Your stepson is HIV positive. The genetic analysis proves that you infected him. Do you want to comment on this?" Morgane was silent for a long time. Then she said softly, "I didn't know I was infected." Müller leaned back. "You haven't had an HIV test in 5 years. You had no symptoms. I thought it was stress, fatigue. I work a lot. Did you have sexual contact with your stepson?" Pause. Then, almost inaudibly, "Yes." The lawyer put a hand on her arm, but she shook him off. "It was just once, after his graduation party. I had been drinking. I know it was wrong, but I didn't know I had HIV. I didn't want to hurt him." Justine Hebert, who had been silent until now, leaned forward. "Theo was 17 at the time of the act. He is your stepson. You were in a position of authority over him. Even if you hadn't known you were HIV positive, which we will still verify, it remains sexual abuse of a person in your care." Morgane stared at her hands. Her lawyer requested a break, but the commissioners had heard enough. They provisionally arrested Morgane Lefebvre. The Freiburg Public Prosecutor's Office filed charges of aggravated sexual abuse of a person in care in conjunction with dangerous bodily harm through HIV transmission. In the following days, investigators searched Morgane's workplace and apartment again. In her nightstand, they found an old medical record, documents from a clinic in Lyon, dated 2014. It stated that she had tested positive for HIV during a routine examination. She had received the result but had not started antiretroviral therapy. Instead, she had moved to Germany and had not disclosed this when she married Samuel. This meant Morgane had known about her infection for 5 years. She had lied to her husband, and she had knowingly had unprotected contact with Theo. The charge was expanded: attempted manslaughter through failure to provide medical information, consequences, and escalation. The news of Morgane's arrest spread quickly in the neighborhood. In a small town like Freiburg, such things don't stay secret for long. Within 2 days, most residents of Tannenstrasse knew. Some showed sympathy, others avoided the Vasseur family's house completely. Samuel Vasseur collapsed internally. He took a leave of absence from work and spent days sitting on the couch, staring out the window. Theo temporarily moved in with his uncle, Samuel's brother, who lived in Offenburg. The distance was necessary. The atmosphere in the family home had become unbearable. Morgane was released on bail under strict conditions. She was not allowed to leave the Freiburg city area and had to report to the police twice a week. A restraining order against Theo was also imposed. She moved into a furnished studio apartment near the main train station. Her lawyer, Attorney Berger, was working on a defense strategy aimed at diminished responsibility due to psychological stress. However, Morgane did not adhere to all the conditions. On September 12, 2019, a Thursday evening, she appeared outside the house in Offenburg, where Theo was now living. She rang the bell several times, calling his name through the intercom. Theo's uncle, Mr. Vasseur, immediately called the police. When the patrol arrived, Morgane was sitting on the steps outside, crying. She was arrested for violating the restraining order and taken into custody for 48 hours. Prosecutor Dr. Marion Keller, who was leading the case, requested a tightening of the conditions. The court ordered an electronic ankle monitor. From then on, Morgane's every movement was monitored by GPS. In parallel, Theo began antiretroviral therapy at the Freiburg University Hospital. The medication successfully suppressed the viral load, but the psychological consequences were severe. He suffered from sleep disorders, nightmares, and panic attacks. A trauma therapist, Dr. Schneider, diagnosed post-traumatic stress disorder. Samuel tried to be there for his son, but feelings of guilt paralyzed him. He constantly wondered how he could have missed the signs. Why had he never noticed Morgane going into Theo's room at night? Why had he blindly trusted his wife? At the end of September, the situation reached a new low. Theo had to return to the house on Tannenstrasse for administrative reasons. He needed certain documents for his university enrollment. His uncle accompanied him, but Samuel wasn't home. The door was locked. Theo still had a key. They entered the house. Everything was dusty, messy. Used plates lay in the kitchen, dirty dishes in the sink. Theo went upstairs to his old room. An envelope lay on the bed there. His name was on it in Morgane's handwriting. He opened it. Inside was a letter, 3 pages long. Morgane wrote that she loved him, that everything was a misunderstanding, that she never intended to cause harm. She accused Dr. Renaud, the police, and even Samuel of working against her. At the end, it read, "If you don't want to see me anymore, then my life is meaningless." Theo dropped the letter. His hands were shaking. His uncle found him minutes later, huddled next to the bed. They immediately left the house and handed the letter over to the police. Chief Inspector Muller read the lines and ordered a psychological evaluation of Morgane. The ankle monitor showed that she had indeed been at the house at the time the letter was dropped off, another violation of the restraining order. But instead of arresting her again, the prosecution decided to move the trial forward. The court date was set for October 14, 2019. Morgane appeared accompanied by her lawyer. She looked gaunt, wore dark clothing, and avoided eye contact. Theo sat with his father on the other side of the hall. Next to them was Dr. Renaud, who had been summoned as a witness. The hearing lasted 3 days. The prosecution presented all the evidence: the DNA analyses, the chat histories, the medical reports, the old medical record from Lyon. Witnesses reported that Morgane was often alone with Theo at home. A neighbor, Hélène Carpentier, testified that she had seen Morgane enter Theo's room late at night through the window. The defense tried to portray Morgane's actions as an exceptional psychological situation. A psychiatric report certified her with a narcissistic personality disorder with impulsive traits. But the court saw no diminished responsibility. The deliberate concealment of her HIV infection over years spoke against any excuse. On the 3rd day of the hearing, the judge announced the verdict: 7 years in prison for aggravated sexual abuse of a person in care and dangerous bodily harm. Morgane burst into tears. Her lawyer immediately announced an appeal, but before the appeal could be heard, something happened that no one had foreseen: the appeal and the confrontation. After the verdict, Morgane Lefebvre was transferred to the Freiburg Correctional Facility. Her lawyer's appeal was underway, but the chances of a reduced sentence was slim. In the prison, she initially behaved inconspicuously. She participated in work therapy and avoided conflicts with other inmates. Meanwhile, Theo tried to rebuild his life. He began his studies in October, but only as a part-time student. The psychological burden was too great for a regular schedule. He continued to see Dr. Schneider, the trauma therapist, weekly. Slowly, very slowly, the nightmares began to subside. Samuel Vasseur returned to his workplace, but colleagues avoided personal conversations. Everyone knew what had happened. He lived alone in the house on Tannenstrasse, which now seemed too big for him. In the evenings, he often sat in Theo's empty room, staring into space. In November, Theo received a letter. The sender was Morgan, written from the prison. He did not open it. Instead, he handed it over to his lawyer, who forwarded it to the prosecution. Dr. Marion Keller read the content and documented it as a further violation of the restraining order. Morgan was prohibited from contacting Theo, even from prison. The letter again contained declarations of love, self-pity, and subtle accusations. Morgan wrote that Theo had destroyed her, that he should have remained silent, that the family would still be intact if he hadn't spoken to Dr. Renaud. The prosecutor requested an extension of the prison sentence for stalking from custody. But then came the surprise. At the end of November, the Karlsruhe Higher Regional Court set a date for the appeal hearing. New expert opinions on Morgan's psychological state had been submitted. A renowned psychiatrist from Munich had attested that she might have suffered from a severe depressive episode at the time of the offense. The court ordered a retrial. Morgan was released on bail again, under strict conditions, this time with continuous electronic monitoring. She moved back into her studio apartment at the train station. The ankle monitor recorded every step. Her lawyer assured the court that she would comply with all requirements. For Theo, this was a shock. The thought of Morgan walking free again, even if monitored, triggered new panic attacks. He refused to leave his uncle's house alone. His father offered to drive him to the university, but Theo dropped out of the semester. He couldn't cope anymore. Samuel sought legal advice. His lawyer assured him that Morgan was under the strictest surveillance despite her release. Any approach to Theo would be immediately registered and would result in immediate rearrest. But that reassured no one. On December 10, 2019, the first incident occurred. The police determined that Morgan's GPS signal had approached Tannenstrasse, within 200 meters of the Vasseur family house. She had sat there for half an hour in a parked car. When patrol officers checked on her, she claimed she was just out for a walk. "It's a public street," she said. "I didn't contact anyone." Technically, this was not a violation. The restraining order prohibited direct approach, but not entering the neighborhood. Nevertheless, the police documented the incident. Prosecutor Keller warned Morgan's lawyer in writing, any further approach would be considered attempted violation. Theo learned about the incident from the police. He no longer left his uncle's house. His psychological state deteriorated rapidly. Dr. Schneider recommended inpatient therapy, but Theo refused. He didn't want to go to a clinic. Samuel sensed his son's despair. He tried to help, but he didn't know how. He couldn't sleep at night. He lay awake, wondering how everything had spiraled out of control. On December 18th, a week before Christmas, Theo had to go back to the house on Tannenstrasse. His passport was there. He needed it for a government matter. His uncle couldn't accompany him, so Samuel offered to be there. They drove together late in the afternoon. The house was cold and dark. Samuel turned on the lights. Theo went upstairs to get his passport. Samuel stayed in the kitchen, putting water on for tea. Suddenly, the doorbell rang. Samuel opened it. Morgan stood outside. The final encounter. Samuel Vasseur stared at his ex-wife, unable to speak. Morgan was wearing a long, dark coat. Her hair was uncombed, her face pale and drawn. The electronic ankle monitor was visible under her trousers. She smiled weakly. "I need to talk to you," she said. Samuel instinctively took a step back. "You shouldn't be here. This is a violation. I'm not here because of Theo. I'm here because of you." "Please, Samuel, just 5 minutes." Upstairs, steps could be heard. Theo was still looking for his passport. Samuel knew he should close the door, call the police, do something. But a part of him, the part that had once loved this woman, hesitated. "What do you want?" Morgane swallowed. "I want to explain why I did it." "There is no explanation." "Yes, there is, and you deserve to hear it." Samuel glanced over his shoulder. Theo was still upstairs. If he saw Morgane, he would freak out. Samuel stepped out onto the porch and closed the door behind him. 5 minutes, then you leave." Morgane nodded. She leaned against the railing, her hands trembling. "I knew I had HIV since 2014, but I thought if I didn't say anything it would disappear. I thought I could lead a normal life. You lied. You lied to me, lied to Theo, lied to everyone. I know, and I'm ashamed of it. But what happened with Theo? That wasn't planned. It was a moment, a single, terrible moment. I'd been drinking, I felt lonely. You were never there. Don't blame me," Samuel interrupted coldly. "I didn't force you to abuse my son." Morgane began to cry. "I love him. Not in the way you think, but I love him. He was the only one who saw me, who really talked to me. You ignored me, Samuel. You treated me like air." "That's not an excuse." "I know." Her voice got louder. "I know there's no excuse, but I wanted you to understand I'm not the monster they think I am. I'm sick. I need help." At that moment, the front door opened. Theo stood there, the passport in his hand. His gaze fell on Morgane. For a heartbeat, there was absolute silence. Then all the color drained from his face. "What are you doing here?" His voice was barely a whisper. Morgane turned to him, her eyes filled with tears. "Theo, please, let me explain." "Go away." Theo's voice cracked. "Get away from here." Samuel stepped between them. "Morgane, you have to leave now, immediately." But Morgane didn't move. Instead, she stepped closer. "Theo, please, listen to me. I know I made mistakes, but you infected me." Theo was shouting now. "You destroyed my life, and now you stand here demanding understanding?" Samuel tried to hold Theo back, but the boy pushed him aside and stepped toward Morgane. "You should have told me you had HIV. You never should have—" He broke off, unable to finish the sentence. Morgane reached out a hand as if to touch his shoulder. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Theo backed away, stumbling over the steps. Samuel caught him. In that moment, sirens wailed in the distance. Someone had called the police, maybe a neighbor, maybe the GPS system had triggered an alarm. Morgane heard the sirens too. Panic flickered in her eyes. "I have to go," she whispered. But before she turned around, she said one more thing. "If I have to go back to prison, then my life is over. You don't understand that, Theo. But you were the only thing that kept me alive. That's not my responsibility." Theo was composed again, his voice icy. "You are responsible for your life, not me." Morgane nodded slowly. Then she turned and walked down the street. The police arrived minutes later. Samuel explained what had happened. The officers noted everything and went looking for Morgane. They found her an hour later, sitting on a bench by the river. She was still crying. The officers took her away. The prosecutor was informed. Morgane's bail was revoked, the release cancelled. She was returned to the correctional facility that same night. Theo and Samuel drove back to Offenburg. Neither spoke during the drive. But both knew. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of the end. 2 days later, Theo received another letter. This time, it wasn't a handwritten letter from Morgane. It was an official notification from the correctional facility. Morgane Lefebvre had requested to receive him as a visitor. She wanted to apologize in person. Theo tore up the letter. The retrial and the final act. The retrial before the Karlsruhe Higher Regional Court took place on January 7th, 2020. Morgane Lefebvre appeared in an orange prison uniform, flanked by 2 correctional officers. Her lawyer, Attorney Berger, had submitted an extensive psychiatric report postulating diminished responsibility due to severe depression and post-traumatic stress disorder from her own past. The presiding judge, Mr. Dr. Holzmann, had all the evidence re-examined. Witnesses were questioned again, but the core facts remained unchanged. Morgane had known she was HIV positive for years. She had concealed this information from her husband. She had had sexual contact with her minor stepson and thereby infected him. Theo André was called as a witness. He appeared accompanied by his father and his therapist. On the stand, he recounted the events of the last few months in a calm but broken voice. He described the night after the graduation party, his confusion, his fear, the feeling of not being able to tell anyone. "She told me no one would believe me," Theo said. "She said my father would think I was a liar, and I believed her, until I got the HIV test." Morgane's lawyer tried to lead Theo into contradictions. "Did you say no at any point?" Theo stared at him. "I was 17, she was my stepmother. I didn't know how to say no." The judge interrupted. "The question is irrelevant. The victim was a minor and the defendant in a position of authority. Consent is legally not possible." The defense also brought up Morgane's past. An expert testified that Morgane herself had been a victim of abuse as an adolescent by an uncle who was never held accountable. This traumatization, the argument went, had led to a disturbed relationship with sexuality and intimacy. But prosecutor Dr. Marion Keller vehemently disagreed. "Many people experience trauma and do not become perpetrators." The defendant had 5 years to disclose her HIV infection. She had access to medical and psychological help. She deliberately remained silent and thereby destroyed her stepson's life. This is not diminished responsibility. This is premeditated action. The court withdrew for deliberation. After 4 hours, Judge Dr. Holzmann announced the verdict. The original sentence of 7 years was confirmed. There was no reduction in sentence. Additionally, Morgane was ordered to pay Theo compensation of 50,000 euros. Morgane collapsed. She cried loudly, screaming that the court had not understood her. Her lawyer tried to calm her. The correctional officers led her out of the courtroom. Samuel Vasseur sat motionless. Theo leaned against the wall, exhausted. It was over. Finally over. But 3 weeks later, on January 28th, the family received news that changed everything. Morgane Lefebvre was dead. She had hanged herself in her cell. A guard had found her in the morning, the bedsheet around her neck. Resuscitation attempts were unsuccessful. In her belongings, a final letter was found, addressed to Theo. The prison management handed it over to the police, who forwarded it to Theo's lawyer. He strongly advised against opening it. "You've been through enough," he said. "Let the past rest." But Theo wanted to read it. He needed closure. So he sat alone in his room one evening and opened the envelope. The letter was short. Just a few lines. "Theo, I know you will never forgive me. I don't ask for it. But I want you to know, what I did was the worst thing in my life. I loved you in a wrong, sick way, and I destroyed you. I can't live with that. I hope you find peace someday. Morgane." Theo folded the letter. He didn't cry. He only felt emptiness. Weeks passed. Theo returned to university, this time full-time. The antiretroviral therapy was working. His viral load was undetectable. He would take medication for the rest of his life.